Do you know what the shortest verse in the Bible is? It's found right here in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, in the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. But before I point that out to you later, first, I want to begin with a story. You know, as a priest for some time now, I've celebrated a number of funerals, over 100. And funerals are a really sad time for us to say goodbye to our loved ones. And I know in particular there are two gospel passages that usually come up during the funerals. The first is from John chapter 14, verses 1 through 6, where Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life." And the other one that's used very often during funerals is this one, this very gospel from John chapter 11. And so I want you to zero in on this story, because you see, here in this very gospel which we're about to explore, Jesus says to us, "I am the way and the truth and the life." And that should just touch us. Because oftentimes, you know, when we think about our own lives, we think about death, right? Living and death. They are two realities. And sometimes when we think about death, we get very saddened by that. But then we take comfort in Jesus' very words that says, "I am the resurrection and the life." And then Jesus turns and he asks us, "Do you believe? Do you believe?" Well, let's go ahead and analyze this gospel now. And before we get started too, I invite all of you, if you haven't already yet, please subscribe to this channel to receive weekly gospel reflections and weekly reflections on the scriptures and also catechesis, catechism, etc. Okay, so let's get started. You know, when we read this gospel passage in particular, we see that it's long. It's a little longer than usual. There are 45 verses, and it can go very deep theologically, right? So we can really get challenged on this story, and sometimes we can get confused as well. And so I want to break it down into 22 main points in this two-part series, this first part, and then we'll pause, and then we'll go into part 2. So I want to make 22 very important points about this story. And I think in order for us to get started, I'd like to propose a question. Think about the last time when you felt hopeless, right? And when you imagine there's no other way, you think this is it, this is the end, right? When was the last time you felt that way? Was it at a funeral? Was it in a situation where you faced and you didn't know how to get out of? Whatever it is may be, at times in our lives, we face a seemingly hopeless situation. I want to propose in particular this very story in which we're entering into. It's a hopeless situation. Lazarus has died. He's died. And everybody's here to grieve and to mourn, and everyone is in great sadness. But from all the sadness and the hopelessness, Jesus shines through. He raises Lazarus to life. And this is a very beautiful story about death and resurrection, and it foreshadows something greater, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ himself. So I want us to really think about the hopeless situation in which we're faced, because that's, you know, the gospel we're entering into right here. St. John the Evangelist, you know, he wants to communicate with us that Jesus is indeed the Messiah, you know, the Messiah whom all the Old Testament prophets have spoken about. So in this story, it demonstrates precisely that. So let's go ahead and get started on the 22 points. So point number 1, I want to draw your attention to the very beginning of this gospel in John chapter 11. The story begins with Lazarus from Bethany is ill. So we're told Lazarus is ill, right? And you can tell too, he's more than just ill, right? He's dying. But I want to get to that in a second. What I want to draw your attention to is the name Lazarus. When's another time we've heard of the name Lazarus? Well, it's found in the Gospel of St. Luke chapter 16, verses 20 to 31, right? Lazarus, the poor beggar. And then this is another Lazarus, Jesus' friend. So what does the name Lazarus mean? I think this is really important. There is a meaning behind this. Lazarus is a derivative of the name Eliezer in the Hebrew, which means God helps, God has helped, God helped, etc., right? And that piece of information is very important, Remember that. It means God has helped. That's what Lazarus' name means. And literally, as we see in this story, God helps Lazarus. Okay, point number two. Point number two. I want to draw your attention to verse 3. The sisters, Martha and Mary, sent word to Jesus that the one you love is ill, right? And as I just shared a moment ago, Lazarus is more than just ill, he's dying. And what's really interesting is this. If we think about it, the message that's being sent to Lazarus, by the time it reached Jesus, there's a chance that he probably has died. You know, because back in those days, you don't have text messages and SMS. You can't send a message right away and they receive it, right? You have to send a messenger, and then that messenger would have to locate, the person they want to give the message to. So it takes about 2 days to get the word to Jesus, and then Jesus waited 2 days, and then he traveled 2 extra days, right? And so those information are all very important. I want you to think about that for a moment. Let's move on to point number 3. Jesus' statement, verse number 4. Take a look at it. What does Jesus say? He says, "This illness is not to end in death, but is for God's greater glory, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." I think this is really important. It's a very important verse. I want you to highlight that right now. We're going to go through that a few times, okay? Verse number 4. That's very important because in order for us to understand this whole story, this is what it's all about. That through this great act, this great miracle, the Son of God is glorified to it. So did Lazarus die? The answer is yes, he did. And we're going to explore that more. But we see, though, God's glory is shown in this very act. More on that soon. Let's move on to point number 4. Very important. The Jews are trying to kill Jesus. They are really, literally trying to kill Jesus. If we go back to the Gospel of John, we see numerous times when the Jews want to kill Jesus, right? And their motivation for killing Jesus is because, a lot of people are following him now, and they don't like that. So they want to get rid of Jesus. So now in this Gospel of John, it's about faith, it's about belief, right? John, the evangelist, wants to emphasize that very point. And we see, though, that Jesus, he doesn't care so much about his own life. He's going back to Judea, right? And his disciples said, "Well, are you sure you want to go back there? They just wanted to stone you a moment ago." And Jesus makes it very clear to them, yes, we need to go back there. So he's going back into the danger zone, so to speak. And this demonstrates to us the greater mission of Christ, right? He came to love us, to save us, to die for us on the cross. And so this here is really nothing to fear for Jesus specifically. Point number 5. I want to draw your attention to verse 9 and 10. This is really important. Begins to get to important. You see, Jesus speaks of night and day, right? You walk during the day. If you walk at night, you'll stumble. Literally, if you take that message, you realize that's true, right? We can't see at night. But we have to go a little bit deeper still, what Jesus is trying to communicate with us here. So, of course, we walk during the day because we can see. At night, we can't see. But if we go even deeper still, daytime signifies the good times, the joy in our lives. Nighttime signifies the pain, the suffering, even the hopelessness, the hopeless moments in our lives. And I want to draw your attention precisely to this point. You know why? Because if we think about it, at times, at the darkest moments in our lives, we have to turn to Jesus, who is the light of Christ. Right? He is the light who shows us the way. And so Jesus is the light in that hopeless situation. So this play on light and darkness, night and day, it draws our attention here. If the crowd focuses on Jesus, who is the light, right? The darkness, the sadness, the weeping, the despair will all go away, right? Focus on Jesus, Christ, who is the light. Now, point number 6. This is important because it gets to the heart of the matter. It gets to the main plot of the story. Is Lazarus asleep or has he died? Is he asleep or is he dead? At first, the verse seems to say he's asleep, but I'm going to go and awaken him. And the disciples are confused, but Jesus makes it very clear to everyone. Lazarus has died, right? Lazarus is dead. Now, I want to pause and ask you to think about this for a moment. What does it mean to live and what does it mean to die? What's living and what's dying, right? Because our understanding of living and dying is of this world, right? We think, well, living is being alive, having life, in other words, and dying is, when you lay down, you're dead, right? And your body can't move, and your heart and your brain stops, etc. That's a literal definition of life and death. But in the Gospel of John, life and death goes even deeper. I'll share with you why. So life is found in God, and death is separation from God. This point is very important. For anyone who wants to experience life and life to the fullness, they must be united with God. They must be one with God. This is really important. If we live our life with God and in God, we will truly be fulfilled. But if we separate ourselves from God, right? If we say, well, God, I don't need you, I don't want you, please don't be around with me, then we separate ourselves from God, and that brings up the question where I propose. So death means separation from God, whereas life means to be with God. This point is really important to understand. So you need to listen to this again. Please make sure to emphasize that very point. We speak of physical life and death, and we speak of spiritual life and death, right? Separation from God is death. United with God is life. Okay, point number 7. And I think this begins to get to something very interesting here. You see, Lazarus is dead, and he's been in the tomb for 4 days, right? Lazarus is in the tomb for 4 days. And I want to draw your attention to the number 4. It's really important because for the Jews, it's like this. Once somebody dies, the body is dead physically, and the soul lingers around the body for 3 days. And after the 3rd day, which is the 4th day, the soul recognizes there's no more hope, so the soul departs, right? This is a Jewish custom. So the reason why St. John the Evangelist emphasized the word 4 days, right? He's dead in the tomb for 4 days. This prolonged length signifies that there is no more hope. It is hopeless. You see, the Jewish people, they've seen moments where someone died and has gone back to life, right? Think of the prophet Elisha, for example, who raised someone from the dead. It is found in the Old Testament. So the fact that we have the number 4 here is to emphasize that it is hopeless. There is no more hope. But wait, there is hope, because with Christ, all things are possible. That's the emphasis here. Okay, I want to move on to point number 8. All right, point number 8, this gets very important now. Think about the funeral scene. Everything that's happening here. Lazarus is dead. The mourners are here. The Jewish friends, people, Martha and Mary are in great distress. There's a lot of sadness, a lot of crying, a lot of emotion. You can just imagine it runs wild, right? Imagine the last time you were at a funeral. Probably you experienced all these emotions as well. And that's what it's like here. And so point number 8 is this scene, this funeral scene where everybody is sad. There's a lot of emotion going on. I want you to imagine that. Place yourself into the scene so that you really see what's going on. Okay? Now, point number 9. Point number 9. This gets very interesting. Jesus arrives on the scene. And when Jesus arrives on the scene, guess what? Martha comes and greets him, right? How does Martha greet Jesus? I want you to pay attention to her words. It's found in verse 21. Here's what she says. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, if we think about that for a moment, on the surface level, we might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Martha, are you blaming Jesus for your brother's death, Lazarus? It sounds kind of like that. But upon closer reading of the matter, what we come to realize is that's her way of expressing sadness that Jesus did not get to see Lazarus when he died, like literally on his deathbed. Imagine for a moment a time when you cannot say goodbye to a loved one, someone you love who's died. I want to give you an example. I have a friend who was in the military, and when he was sent overseas, for a prolonged period of time, in the process, his father had a heart attack and died suddenly. And he was very saddened by the fact that he could not be there when his father has died. It's sort of like the same play on word here. if you will. So just imagine something like that. And also too, keep in mind, as I shared towards the beginning of this video, when Jesus received a word that Lazarus is ill, chances are he may have died already, right? And Jesus waited 2 days, and it takes about another 2 days to travel there. So by the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus has been dead in the tomb for 4 days. That's important, okay? 4 days. Now, point number 10. Point number 10. I want to draw your attention to the significance of verses 23 and 24. Jesus says to Martha, "Your brother will rise." And then Martha says to Jesus, "I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Just zero in on these two verses, 23 and 24 for a moment. In a certain sense, Martha has accepted the reality that her brother Lazarus has died, and that Jesus assures her that he will rise. And she's thinking, well, right, yes, rise on the last day, on the literal level, literal interpretation of this gospel. That's what we're thinking about. Because Martha has accepted that Lazarus is dead. But we go even deeper, and you see something very interesting here. Go deeper, and Jesus is telling Martha that her brother will rise literally, right? He's going to rise very soon. He will be raised from the dead. And so she doesn't quite catch on to that just yet, okay? And that's a very important point. Yes, we all rise on the last day, but Lazarus is about to be risen from the dead. Of course, he dies again, and then the resurrection on the last day. But literally in this story, Lazarus is going to rise again. And it's going to demonstrate the glory of God, right? This is very important. Now, that's 10 points so far. I want to pause our video here, take a break, and then once you're ready, move on to part 2. And I also want to emphasize too, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button down here below, the red button, so that you can receive weekly gospel reflections and also weekly lessons on catechesis, on faith, etc. Join me as we learn the Catholic faith.